Okay, we're now being recorded. Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, lovely to see everyone here and everyone on the camera. Just before I start, actually, the next few weeks are going to be a little bit disrupted because I'm going to be away already. No, next week I'll give share, then the week after that I'll be in Poland on a school trip, and then we also have a school trip to Israel and so on. So it's going to be a bit on off. I guess all that means is check your emails, which I'm sure you anyway do constantly. So just monitor your shul emails. As a result, I decided just to do a couple of sort of mini topics rather than a more extended sort of series. And then we'll after I'm back more consistently, we'll switch back to a series. So I am still open for nominations for more significant topics. But for now and next couple of occasions, I just started to answer one of questions I was asked. So I've saved lists of questions that have been asked to me, and some of them are not full topics to explore, but just sort of short things. This was a question that was asked to me last week, and I thought I'd just use today to explore. And the question was put as follows. It says that we're following in the news at the moment the protests in Iran, protests in Iran. And probably as followers of Western media, there's a significant part of us that's empathetic to those demonstrating against the rule of theocracy that's forcing them to dress in a certain way, and particularly women are targeted to dress in a manner which restricts their freedom and liberty and self-expression. And there's a part of us that's quite supportive of this. On the other hand, is this in line with perhaps how we should view things and how we should consider it? It's true that we don't share the same dress code as is being enforced there, but nonetheless, surely halacha does mandate tznius and appropriate attire, and halacha has a system of enforcement. So, in an ideal Jewish state, would this not be something that we would approve of and something that we want? So everyone's looking very uncomfortable, but this is the question that was asked. And it's an important question because it brings out a sort of question of what does halacha believe around enforcement, and is that in line with Western values? Maybe it makes us uncomfortable, this question, but you just open the Torah, you open Nevi'im and Ksuvim, and you see quite a lot around that. So does halacha believe in enforcement, and what would be an ideal way of running a Jewish society? Would we have the equivalence of this sort of thing going on? I think this is a legitimate question, albeit an uncomfortable one. So there's a number of responses I thought we could use this morning to discuss. Avram, you don't like this topic?
When numbers of some didn't have the same enforcements.
That's the question. What were they enforcing? What weren't they? And at the end of the day, there's no getting away from the fact that a halachic system has a court system which doesn't just enforce civil action and perhaps prevention of major crimes that impact on other people, but enforced halacha in a fuller sense. I mean, part of the problem or challenge behind this is that really in 2022, our moral code that we easily subscribe to in our minds, we make a difference between perhaps religious and spiritual practices on the one hand and morality on the other hand. And a moral code really has shrunk to don't do things that will hurt other people. That's the sort of to a degree the extent of moral code that is easily explicable and that people ring to. As long as no one else is going to be harmed, it's difficult to say why should the state or society interfere in it.
What's more used to that makes it different? I know it's to a degree in laws of sneers, but we're used to seeing women are dressed in a certain way, which is not within Jewish law.
Yes.
But it doesn't affect us. I mean, this is a critical point. It doesn't affect us in the same way that it would have done 2,500 years ago, because they dressed all covered up.
For sure. So the question was posed in the concept of tznius, but really it's actually bringing out a broader point, which is in general the concept of a theocracy and what does that look like, and what religious experience, what religious transgressions that perhaps we don't see as moral failures don't hurt anyone else, but they're just a breach of whatever religious code you happen to follow, whether it's halacha or whether in this context or whether it's Sharia law. Is that appropriate to enforce or not? So you're correct. They're clearly, and again, I mean, then you get to the thorny issue of exactly who's the posek, the paskins, which level of practice and stringency, and how to deal with when there are differing views. But I'm using this as a springboard. The question was asked in that context, and I did put out a call to ask for questions. So people posed many very fascinating questions. This was the way this question was posed, and obviously what's going on in Iran triggered in their minds a little bit of thought around what would be the context of this. I did speak actually once on I think on the Shavuos night about a theocracy and whether our dream state would be a theocracy, and what would such a country look like, and is this what we aspire to? And I think these are questions that as Jews in 2022 we perhaps should think about. So there's a school of thinkers that address many areas of historic change in Judaism, change often externally imposed on Judaism due to events that have occurred beyond our control, which mean that we don't live in a halachic system completely that seems to be in line with how Tanakh and perhaps Gemara lay out halachic life. And there's a stream of thinkers that argue that rather than seeing this as a pure negative and just as a loss of our ability to function fully halachically, we should rather see it as a reflection of a deeper spiritual reality and a tweaking or altering in how we are appropriately meant to grow as spiritual people, as people who care about transcendence, who want to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to Hashem, and serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and be the best possible people we can. These figures include Rabbi Sacks, Rabbi Henkin, Rav Kook, Rabbi Menachem Rabinovitz, and I simply want to share their ideas because the message they give is subtle, is nuanced, is difficult, is challenging, and is complex. But I think a very important one, and I thought I'd just use this morning in this question as a trigger to address this. So let's start off from two classic sources that, in a sense, are non-controversial. The first is an event that we just read about last week, which is the expulsion of Adam Rishon from Gan Eden. Now, clearly, the Pasuk is telling us that Gan Eden is the ideal state of existence of human beings. The Parshas Bereishis is dealing with the paradox, or maybe I'll explain the Pasukim first, and then we'll just deal with how it's dealing with something very fundamental, the heart of what it means to be a human being. Because it's telling us that the ideal, at least in theory, position for a human being to live is in a garden of delights, in a Gan Eden, where there's no external pressure, no challenges, no health concerns, no livelihood struggles, no relationship problems. We have this ideal life in which we can do what? We can grow and develop ourselves as people in ethically, morally, in Musa, in intellectual achievements. This is the ideal human scenario. Yet in practice, what happens in that situation? And if we're being told about this occurring to Adam, we're being told something about what all humans do, because Adam is the archetype of human beings. He's not just Adam, an individual, but he's also Adam, mankind, humankind. What happens when you're in that situation? You fail. Something goes wrong. And then one gets expelled from Gan Eden, and everything changes. One has to struggle to survive. One no longer has this ever long life or never-ending life, but death is brought into the world, and suddenly we're living in a completely different condition, a completely different position. And the Mefarshim nearly unanimously don't view this as Hashem is just punishing Adam. What Hashem is saying to Adam is the worst thing in the world would be for you to stay in Gan Eden, because to be in a Gan Eden where there's no pressures and no conflict and no challenges and no limitations and just infinite possibilities, in theory is an ideal, but in practice, at least where you are up to, if you don't have the self-motivation, self-control, the self-discipline, and the self-drive, this is going to be the worst possible position for you to be in. The analogy I've used, and I think possibly I've used it here before, is all our holidays, right? So I don't know everyone else, I can only speak for myself. Every holiday I come into the holiday, delighted that I've got tons of free time, and there's all sorts of good things I'm going to do. So some of them are technical and boring. I'm going to tidy up my desk and sort through paperwork and so on and so on. But a lot of them are things that really matter to me. There's a whole list of books that I want to read my way through, and loads of places that I want to visit. Now, what percentage of the holiday do I end up doing any of those things? You know, when I emerge from my holiday, how many of those books have I actually read, and how many days? Very, very few, because most of the holiday I spend on just doing nothing, because that's what happens when there isn't the external pressure. So having an external pressure, having an external challenge, having a target, having a goal is necessary for human beings. And really what Parshas Bereishis is calling on us to do, as so much of the Torah, is to sort of think about the paradoxes at the heart of human conditions. There's a part of us that longs for the dream life, the easy life. There's a part of us that revolts at the idea that when we have such magnificent minds with so much that we want to achieve and so much good that we want to do, that we're so frustrated and stymied and limited by the constant pressures of earning our living and navigating all the challenges that meet us in life, in relationships and in health and everything else. There's a part of us that doesn't believe we should die. There's a part of us that's very profoundly in denial of mortality, that believes we are infinite. And the Torah is telling us none of these things come from a bad place. They're good. They're a real part of what a human being is, because there's a profound part of ourselves that knows that this life that we live is ridiculous and crazy, in which we're driven mad and hassled and harried and we have such a short space of time on earth. There's a part of us that knows that we're meant to be infinite beings, that we can touch eternity, that we can achieve things of absolute worth. But the paradox of existence is we can only do that when we have none of that, when we're struggled, when we're forced to have external goals set upon us, when we've got the difficult and troubles and travails and hassles of everyday life. And without that, we would probably achieve very little. And what the Torah says is that there is a dream of a return to Gan Eden. The Torah speaks about there's a path back to Gan Eden, the Derech Etz Chaim, that is blocked by the Kuruvim and the swelling swords, and so one needs to continue and learn Bereishis and understand the message it's giving. But the point I'm trying to draw out from this in the context of our discussion is that is it a good or a bad thing that we're expelled from Gan Eden? And the answer is it depends on your perspective. In many respects, it's a bad thing. Clearly, that's what the Torah is laying out from us. We lose this perfect dream life, this ideal vision. On the other hand, in the context of the reality of where Adam, the individual, Adam, human beings, already up to, it was the best possible thing. It was a bracha that we were excluded from Gan Eden, because it's only outside Gan Eden that we can grow and develop as human beings should be. Hashem didn't remove us from Gan Eden because he's cruel. Hashem is an infinite world of goodness and bounty to offer us. There's no punishment, doesn't achieve anything of any worth. Why would Hashem want to punish human beings? And it only makes sense in our thinking if it's a route back to a better existence. When we spoke about Olam Haba, I shared that in our Hashkafa, we don't believe in the concept of eternal damnation. There's no such concept. The Moral speaks about Yud Beis Chodesh, 12 months, the idea of a year, a full mini cycle of human life within which punishment can be given. Eternal damnation wouldn't make sense because it's just causing needless suffering. What for? Why should someone be eternally damned? What would be the point? What would be the purpose of that person's existence? Why should they suffer endlessly? If they have no opportunity for salvation, no opportunity for improvement and growth, and we believe, unlike some of our sister faiths, we believe that all humans have within them the quality and the ability to change and improve and rebuild themselves. Why should there be eternal damnation? What would be the point of that? All punishment has to ultimately be in order to bring people back into a path of growth and opportunity. Now, I'm not sitting here in the context of a share at 9:15 when dealing with something else, talking about all of human suffering and all of the struggles we face and so on. We've spoken about suffering and struggles before and the different schools of thought from the Mekabalim and the Rambam around that. I'm not sitting here arguing that we all live in the best of all possible worlds and that every challenge that we face is an opportunity of easy to find growth. I'm simply saying that there are it is non-controversial that within certain of the classic stories that we read in the Torah, which are clearly bad outcomes in the sense that it's tragic that this is the way it had to be, equally in the context of where we're up to, this was the right route for us to continue to grow as human beings. We couldn't stay in Gan Eden. It's been disastrous for us to stay in Gan Eden. So this is one example of an event which is imposed upon us as a limitation and a punishment, but in truth, in the context of where we're up to, is the correct route for spiritual growth. And just to outline where I'm going to be taking this argument, so that as we go through it, you can see where we're heading. I'm going to be arguing that the fact that we are living in a world where we cannot enforce religious values, in some respects, comes from a negative, a loss of a Sanhedrin, a loss of a Beis HaMikdash, a loss of a Torah autonomous state, and on the other hand, reflects something positive in the context of what it means to be a spiritual person and someone who cares about being an Eved Hashem, growing as a person of transcendence in today's world. So that's where the argument is going to go. But I want to start off from the less controversial argument examples of that, and then move forward to the more original and creative and perhaps controversial ideas of Menachem Rabbi Novitz and others. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The Medrash that comments on if you look in the story of Bereshis, most of the time Hashem looks at the world and says it's tov, it's good. Tov, by the way, the literal translation of tov is functional. So it's when we talk about something being good, what we mean is it's fit for purpose. If you're a good person, it means you're a person who's fit for purpose. You're doing that which is purposeful and functional in the fullest spiritual sense. But you can describe a table as a shulchan tov. This is a good table. That doesn't mean it's good in a moral sense. It means it's functional and it's good as what tables are meant to be. So the Yetzer HaTov is good. And the Torah, the Psukim describe Hashem looking at the world and saying it's tough many times. It's good, right? It's constant refrain through the story of Bereshis. It's good. On 2 occasions, Hashem describes the world as tov ma'od, as very good. And the Medrash comments on that: tov, good, is the Yetzer HaTov. Tov ma'od, very good, is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Meaning, if you don't just want to be tov, functional, like a table is functional, but you want to be a human being, and you want to be tov ma'od, you want to be beyond good, and excuse me, again, then he's thought, what does it mean to be beyond good? That's only because we have a Yetzer Hara, because there's a negative side within us. So in a sense, this is all part of the same of one conversation. So sorry.
One explanation from Mashiach, if we go back to what it was like in Gan Eden,
Yes.
where I know that it's hard to know what you said that before, but we will be learning all the time. We won't have worries about Parnasa. We have non-Jews doing all the work for us. Is that what growth is? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to take you on a different path. I thought the whole purpose, what we're aiming for, is that type of life.
So we can do a separate look. I think we once did, but we can revisit what the era of Mashiach is. Your summary, I'm not sure is entirely capturing exactly what we bring out from it. But what I would say is that there are aspects of Mashiach that indeed are disturbing in the context of this discussion. And Chazal already sensitive to this. It's really a pasuk that we just read in Koheles, in which the Koheles near the end talks about Yomim Asherim Bahem Chayfetz, days which have no desire in them. And there's a Medrash that comments on this. This is talking about Yemos Mashiach. Now that can be a positive. Yemos Mashiach is a time in which we have no Yetzer Hara, and it can also be a negative. Days that have no desire, Yomim Asherim Bahem Chayfetz. Do we want to live in a time when there's Yomim Asherim Bahem Chayfetz? And it's exactly this conversation that the truth is, if we think about Gan Eden now as we are, if we think about Yemos Mashiach as we now currently are, there ought to be a part of us that's bothered by it. And that's the whole problem or paradox of it, that for how we currently are, an endless holiday should not be an appealing model. And this is indeed why it's the best thing for us not to be there. Maybe there's a tragedy that we're not up to an endless holiday, but if we're not up to it, the worst thing in the world for us would be to have this endless holiday. And this is the whole point. For a rare human being, and we dream of a day when the whole of society will be able to move towards that, to be given endless time to engage in I wouldn't just say learning Torah, but to engage in all sorts of good pursuits. What a dream. But for now, only a dream, because we're not up to that. And this is sort of the point. You can't, this is really the theme that I wanted to bring out. One can't just look at the externals of a situation and say, if only those externals were restored, if we're not understanding that there's a reason why these externals have been removed, and that's because there's an internal aspect of ourselves that can't connect or appreciate it. And it's only when the internal is changed that we can get back to the external. So we can't just work on the externals of a Gan Eden or rebuilding a Beis HaMikdash, right? There's movements of Jews to this day who want to rebuild a Beis HaMikdash. We can't just work on the externals of that, because it'd be profoundly and fundamentally unrelatable to, damaging for us, a ruinous of true transcendence were we to do this, unless we're in an internal position for this to be meaningful and engageable for us, and then we can be, then it would be a positive. So and this is really what the Torah is telling us. We live a life of a dream of the eternal holiday, but actually it'd be the worst thing in the world for us, unless we're really up to it, unless we would be able to use it well, because we possess the qualities of personality that was in ours. 100%. But what we mean by that is we're waiting for the internal changes, and societal changes would allow that to be a positive experience rather than a negative experience. There's a reason Mashiach's not coming. Again, God doesn't despise human beings. He doesn't hate human beings. Why would he want this miserable, I mean, thank God there's many good things, but there's aspects of life which is profoundly miserable. Why would he want that there? So I'm conscious that on a personal basis, this is a very difficult question to ask, and it gets us into deeper questions around human suffering. I don't want to go down there. But just on a very broad brushstroke level, why should this state of existence. Why aren't we in Gan Eden? God's short of Gan Edens to give us. He couldn't allow us a world where we can all earn our parnasa easily and without challenge and without. And the answer is because. And the truth is, I don't just mean this as high figures in philosophy. I mean this on a very practical level. As much as we moan about work and other such challenges, I think if we are lucky enough to have a job that we find meaningful, for many of us, it's actually a very positive part of our identity and something that we find profoundly significant. And again, it could be a separate talk. What meaning can we find in work, and how should we view the fact that we're engaged in so much of our life spent in physical living? It depends what you mean. There isn't an easy yes and no answer to the question of, is it b'diavad? Is it a non-ideal that we work? Is it a non-ideal that we're out of Gan Eden? Is it a non-ideal that we don't have a Beis Hamikdash? The answer to all of these, on some levels, yes. But on other levels, given how we actually are, if we're honest with ourselves, no, it's the ideal. And that's the point. We need to be honest with ourselves about that. Sorry, Avram, you wanted to.
There's a discussion somewhere in the Talmud about the Yetzer Hara, or part of the Yetzer Hara disappearing, and the word stops functioning. Chickens don't lay eggs.
Yeah, absolutely. The Gemara that talks about, the Gemara discusses a very mystical Gemara, which talks about the phenomena that at one point in history, at least across what we would nowadays call the Western world, the Mediterranean basin, there was a sudden removal of paganism. And the Gemara describes a mystical experience of the destruction of the Yetzer Hara for paganism, for Avodah Zarah. The Gemara links it to the other sources, the Seder Hadoros and the Vilna Gaon, links it to the rise of Greek science and philosophy. And the Gemara then says that those who led that mystical revolution said, well, let's remove the Yetzer Hara completely. And when the Yetzer Hara was removed completely, humans stopped having ambition and drive. We lost the competitive edge, stopped procreation, desire was lost. So the Yetzer Hara is very, very important for us to be humans. We don't know what it would mean to be a human without a Yetzer Hara. We'd be robotic. So as much as we all aspire, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I had no negative sides to my personality? It's the most blessed part of ourselves. Tov Ma'od, it's the good part of ourselves that we have flaws, because actually every flaw we have is our best friend. Hug it and embrace it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to have flaws because, and actually, they give us a very key target as to what we're meant to be doing with our lives, what our mission is meant to be, what we're meant to be achieving. If you turn to yourself or you turn to someone and say, what does God want from me? What should I be doing with my life? A difficult question to answer, not one that any of us dare easily answer. But at least one tool in answering that question is, okay, what are my failures? What are my failings? Where aren't I doing well? And it gives me the path forward to know where to go. We without a Yetzer Hara, what would achievement be? What would decision making be? I mean, being a human being, seemingly, ostensibly, would be being a glorified Coke machine, right? A Coke machine does a lot of chesed. I mean, it does beautiful it gives out chocolate bars and cans of soda, but it has no achievement in so doing. So is that what we want to be a human being? Which again poses the whole theological challenge of what was the purpose of existence in Gan Eden? What are we aspiring to in the world to come? Yomim Hashem B'hem Chayfet, days that have no desire in them. So again, I'm not. If someone's happy just to note this can remind us of agendas of future talks. We should talk maybe again about suffering. Again, we should talk about Gan Eden. Maybe we should talk about Adam pre the sin. I don't think we've ever done that, like a proper analysis of the story of Gan Eden. And there's one other thing that came up. The Mashiach we spoke about, and Mashiach, and anyway, these are topics of discussion. But you're absolutely right. The Torah in the first Sedras is grappling with. They're so profound, these stories. They're grappling with the sort of internal paradox at the heart of human existence, in which we aspire and long for things which we see as how we should ideally live, and yet when we're really honest with ourselves, would probably be the worst way to live. And how do we resolve that tension? Sorry, you want to say something? We would ostensibly be malachim. By the way, we can have angels as another topic. I don't think we've ever spoken about angels. It's all okay. So I'll try and listen to the recording and write this down as I do. Yeah.
Is to say that if the Yidden don't make Kiddush on Friday night, the Goyim will make Havdalah. In other words, anti-Semitism is in that sense a good thing in some capacity, but it makes us realise who we are. And in a similar way, I think the Yetzer Hara and the Pope could be compared to the same idea. I don't know.
So I'm actually making notes of all these topics that are coming up, because this gives us the next 6 months of a series. So again, all these statements are true, but have to be thought about with great care. And they also have to be handled sensitively because, tell that to the victim of anti-Semitism who's just had their life. But the core idea that all or many or some bad experiences that we go through have within them a shell of negativity within which, if we dig deep enough, can be drawn out something very profoundly positive, and in many respects can be. Look, I don't want to oversimplify and talk about what can be a very painful subject, and it's very easy sitting here, thank God, in the amazing comfort of Hendon with Baruch Hashem broadly a good life, and certainly we as an outsider could never say to someone who's suffering, like, well, this is a good thing. All we can comment on is a fact, which is when you speak to people who have been through life challenges, in many respects, relationship-wise or health-wise, sometimes really, really profound challenges, many of them do look back and say, in some respects, this was a very positive, something I would never give up on. In some respects, this just taught me to appreciate life that I took for granted. Some people emerge from that and don't say that. Some people emerge from this and find this is something terrible. And I don't want to be sort of flippant about it, but there are sometimes we do achieve moments of insight in our lives in which we actually see something that was very, very profoundly challenging and negative as having given us something positive. Sometimes we don't. But the at least on a level of trying to analyze aspects of Jewish history, these are thoughts expressed by many classical commentators that the emergence of Adam from a Gan Eden was on the one hand a negative, on the other hand something very, very positive about the human condition. Again, I think I may have said this before, so if I'm repeating myself. I'm no sociologist, and therefore maybe what I'm saying is either sociologically wrong or politically incorrect. I read a book once which argued that, it's a good convenient way of blaming this idea on someone else, but it's true. I read a book once which argued that if you look at the areas in which significant civilizations arose across the globe, whether we're talking about Aztecs and Incas, whether we're looking as one enters into Europe, the Greek civilizations, and as one goes further across, those based in Mesopotamia, the Babylonian and the Hittite Empire and so on, and then we move further to India and China, the sort of belt from which all the great civilizations emerged, all of them had certain commonalities, and in geographical and in geographical location, which is they were neither located in areas in which life was so difficult that there was such a constant battle for survival that there was no time for any longer term further thinking. So they didn't develop, in the far north of the Arctic cold. They didn't develop in the desert, in which there's literally just subsistence. On the other hand, they also didn't develop in the parts of the world in which life was completely leisurely, in the islands of paradise, in which the weather is temperate the whole year and there's no need to build shelters, no need to engage in trapping animals for clothing or to develop technologies of farming because you just pick the fruit that are growing on the trees. No need to Simon did tell me he was leaving early. He's not walking out. Somebody should stomp out now and slam the door at this. They didn't develop in parts of the world. In other words, what spurred civilization seems to be a combination of if you're in an area where no matter how hard you work, you're never going to be able to support yourself in any reasonable, you're going to need constant work, civilization won't develop. But in a world in which there's no spur for working either, and in which one's just has nature is giving such bounty, there's no particular push. Also, civilizations don't develop. They develop in the Goldilocks zone, in which if you work hard, you can achieve something. You're Gato Matzosotamin, right? You work hard and you found something, you can achieve something. And it's an undoubted sad fact of human history that times of great technological and scientific advance, often are wartime, times of conflict, many inventions are linked to the struggle to survive. Is this a good facet of human beings? Absolutely not, which is the message of the story of the Chet of Mission. This is driven by sin and failure. On the other hand, do humans have within us a force that of negativity and sin? We do also. And given that, existing out of the Gan Eden is the best possible place we can be. So this is the thinking of many of them from the story of Gracious. And since you mentioned it, I mentioned the Beis Mikdash, you mentioned Gan Eden, again, very classic thinkers, and at this point, nothing I'm saying is controversial really, say the same around the Churban Beis Mikdash, the destruction of the Beis Mikdash. The Nefesh Chaim, R Chaim Velozhiner points it out, and others do. This is indicated in the halachic system, in which at the point that the Beis Mikdash actually began being destroyed, which is Tisha B'Av afternoon, the atmosphere lightens. And the idea behind it is what we're really mourning is pre-Tisha B'Av, the events that led to the necessity of the destruction. But once we were in that situation, the best thing possible was the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, because we weren't up to having a Beis Hamikdash. So is the destruction of the temple, of the Beis Hamikdash, a good thing or a bad thing? It depends what you mean by that. Obviously, it's a bad thing, given that it was necessary. But in truth, in the very poetic words of R Chaim Velozhiner, the inner Beis Hamikdash had long been destroyed. The external Beis Hamikdash was really a shell of the Beis Hamikdash. That was destroyed by the Romans and the Babylonians the time before. The inner Beis Hamikdash, where is the Beis Hamikdash? Levodi Mishkan Eshkon, right? The Shachamti B'Sochom. The true place where the divine is meant to rest is within ourselves. The true place where we're meant to build a Mishkan for Hashem, a tabernacle for Hashem, is within Levovi, is within our hearts. When that's destroyed, then the external Beis Hamikdash is actually distraction. It's the worst possible thing that can exist. The Medrash phrases this by saying, better for God to take out his anger on sticks and stones than on human beings. But what this means to say is that there's a choice. Either remove the externals or destroy those who are lacking the internal. God forbid that God should destroy those who are lacking the internal, therefore better to remove the externals. It's not for nothing that we struggle to relate to the spirituality inherent in the Beis Hamikdash. That's exactly the point. We don't have a Beis Hamikdash because we can't relate to it, and we can't relate to it because we don't have it. The change the true change that would necessitate, would enable the building of a Beis Hamikdash is a change within us that would allow it to revert to being something meaningful, and then the possibility of it being external. If we ask ourselves, what's hopefully we have to some degree or other, as difficult as Yom Kippur is, hopefully we have to some degree or other meaningful Yom Kippur. If we ask ourselves, what model of Yom Kippur would we prefer? Standing in shul with a time for tefillah, time for reflection, saying vidah and the like, or standing there in the outskirts of the Azorah and the Har HaBayis and the Beis Hamikdash, watching and waiting for the Kohen Gadol to go in and out and do his avodah in the Kodesh Kodashim. It's very hard to relate to the Beis Hamikdash. Very hard to see it as a way of serving a Kodesh Baruch Hu. And that's exactly the point. We had the Beis Hamikdash become, as the Nevi'im cried out to the Jewish people, "Lomali rose of Chechem." You know, I don't want your multiplicity of sacrifices of korbanos. I want you to do the things I really care about. The development of humans, the care for those who are vulnerable, and so on and so forth. If you're going to lose all that, then Beis Hamikdash has ceased being a prop, and it's become ceased being a useful tool. It's just become a prop to prop up an illusion, a false illusion of spiritual well-being and existence. So just to summarize what we've said so far, within classic thinkers, this idea is expressed. In a moment, we'll see that it's taken further by some of the more recent thinkers. In classic thinkers, this idea is expressed that many of the negatives of human or Jewish history, often ostensibly caused by external forces imposed upon us, in many respects negative, but in equally many respects positive, because given the changed circumstances, this is the necessary condition for us to flourish in, grow in, and remain people who can access spirituality. This is the idea that's being expressed. The classic ones are the Mefarshim on Bereshis, who spoke about the expulsion from Gan Eden. Have a look at the Rambam and the R Chaim, the Midrashim, and so on. The Nefesh Chaim speaks about that in the context of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, and many other indications of this. So let me give the next example of this. It is a reality that we live in a world in which we don't impose capital punishment. There used to be a time in history where just open a chumash in which there's a series of capital punishments given to criminals who break halacha. Some of them refer to criminals who break halacha in a way that perhaps we can still relate to, depending on your personal and political views around this, murder and other heinous crimes like that. So probably some of us in this room think capital punishment's okay for that, some of us don't. But some of them, and if you can relate to the argument for that, and others relate to capital punishment that's profoundly disturbing, right? Chil Shabbos, is that what we're meant to do? If we were able to set up a theocracy now, would we be going back to that? I mean, surely that would be a good thing. Chil Shabbos, terrible thing. Let's go around, Eidim, Hasra, put people to death for doing this. Is that the ideal model? So again, this is a classic example of actually how Chazal saw things differently. And what they argued is, in a theoretical sense, it would be an ideal model. But in a practical sense of where we are up to, it would be a terrible thing. And let me explain what I mean by that. The Gemara tells us that many years, 70, 100 years before the Churban Beis Hamikdash, before the destruction of the temple, Chazal used a halachic mechanism to stop them being able to apply capital punishment. And the mechanism is that, we won't go into it in detail now, the capital punishment can only be applied by courts throughout the lands of Israel in a case where the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, sits in the Lishkas HaGozis, in the chamber on the Temple Mount. We spoke about this tangentially when we discussed authority of the sages of Chazal and Torah Sheba'al Peh, and we looked extensively at the Psukim in Sefer Devarim, which speak about the rule of law emerging from Amokim Asher Hashem, from the place which Hashem has chosen, from the Temple Mount, from the Beis Mikdash. And the Torah links the two together. In other words, this ultimate seat of law is linked to the Beis Mikdash, which allowed a mechanism to cease the ability to remove the ability of courts to impose punishments, which was by the Sanhedrin moving out of the Lishkas HaGozis. And they chose to move out of the Lishkas HaGozis to stop the application of capital punishment. Now, the truth is, even before them, capital punishment was vanishingly rare because of the nature of how halacha works. Meaning to say that in order to achieve capital punishment, there has to be edim, there has to be witnesses, there has to be hasra. Hasra has to be explicit, there has to be a warning given to the person. The warning has to be in the presence of two witnesses. The potential criminal has to be aware that there are two witnesses there. The warning has to include that fact. It has to say there are two witnesses here observing what you're doing. And if you do this, you will be put to death. And the criminal has to acknowledge it. And as the criminal has to respond, afal pikein, even so. So all they have to do is keep quiet, and no capital punishment would be possible. All they have to do is momentarily desist till the Adam cease to be there, and no capital punishment is possible. I mean, one could argue that any criminal who, despite all of this, went there to do the crime, maybe to have the halachic status of a shota, someone who is not criminally competent to make decisions, and for anyway would be exempt from capital punishment. This is reflected in another famous Mishnah. In the Mishnah, says any court which puts people, the Mishnah brings a series of and the Gemara around it brings a series of brises in which various Tanoim and Amraim say, I would save if I was in court, if I was still living in a time in which we did capital punishment, we're talking about figures post-Beis Hamikdash, I would ensure that no one was ever put to death, because the system is so designed to be so theoretical. The Mishnah says a court which puts someone to death once in a generation, once in 70 years, was considered a bloodthirsty court. So it had become, or always was, almost a rule in the books rather than something actually applied. Very, very similar to Ben Sorah, again a theoretical halacha, but sometime pre the Churban Beis Mikdash, perhaps around the reign of Herod, the Beis Din voluntarily chose to remove completely its ability to apply capital punishment. Yeah, I'll come to that in a moment. Yeah, why did Beis Din choose to do this? So the Gemara tells us because nisrabu haroitzchim, because murder rates had gone up, and therefore they no longer felt it was appropriate to do capital punishment. Now, this is most mysterious. I mean, there's a number of theories as to why courts punish. One theory, there's a whole area of philosophy that discusses what's the basis of the legal right for society or courts to impose punishment. One theory is a deterrent. If you don't punish, people will commit crimes. If the Torah adopts a theory of deterrence in its capital punishment system, then when crime goes up, you up the punishments. You don't diminish them. You don't stop putting people to death because there are more murderers around. A second theory of punishments is preventative, that you put people in prison or put them to death to stop them murdering other people. Again, if crime rates go up, you up your preventative measures. You don't put them down. So what? And there's various other theories. What is the Torah's theory of punishment? What's this punishment about? And the answer is the Torah tells us itself. It says, "Laman yishmu b'yiroi v'lo yizidonod," so that people will see that this is wrong and not sin further. Or biyata hara mikabecha, one should expunge, remove evil from our midst. In other words, it's taking an existential approach to punishment. Punishment is an expression of a profound understanding that there are certain crimes that put people beyond the pale of right to exist, has dehumanized them to such a profound degree that they don't deserve to exist. If murder rates go up, in other words, a society has ceased to value human life like that, then punishment of capital punishment is no longer relevant. It's no longer applicable. It's no longer appropriate. This is a society that has lost its valuing of what this stands for, and therefore capital punishment is no longer something relevant. We have to educate, we have to inspire, we have to teach, but capital punishment is the worst tool in the world to use for that. Or by extension, we would say Chil Shabbos, and again, I'm conscious and sensitive or aware that this is sensitive, but let's just try and draw it out in an understandable way. we value Shabbos. We think it's so profoundly part of what it means to be a transcendent human being. A human being has a relationship to eternity, that the Torah is able and prepared to say that someone who loses that loses existence. But which sort of person loses existence? Someone living in a world in which Shabbos is obvious. Someone living in a world in which prophets still speak. Someone living in a world in which an act of Chilul Shabbos is a decision to rupture their relationship with the spiritual. Is any Mechalel Shabbos at the time already then when Chazal chose to lose the right to capital management, and Kal V'chomer, how much more so now, is any Mechalel Shabbos declaring a desire to rupture spirituality? Is there a rebellion against Torah or halacha? Is this a defiance of God in so doing? Is this genuinely a way to restore the forgotten transcendence and spirituality, which we're also desperate to internalize ourselves? And were we able to spread it beyond that? Is punishment or enforcement a reasonable way of making people more transcendent, or would it do the opposite? Would it despiritualize? Would it dehumanize? So what Chazal is saying is, the worst thing in the world now would be for us to enforce, would be for us to punish. Nisra B'Harotzim has become less of an appreciation of this. We need to now go back to working on the internal. When the internal was obvious to everyone, it's easy for us perhaps to imagine that with murder, and very difficult to imagine that with Shabbos. But imagine a society in which it was tangibly, visibly apparent to everyone that murder is a complete destruction of self. That Shabbos we live in a society, a world, so aware of our connection to Hashem, so aware of spirituality, in a world in which God still communicates to human beings. And in such a world, it's obvious that the decision to make Shabbos, the decision to deny and fragment and bifurcate oneself as a human being, that's a very different universe. But when that ceases to be, the worst thing in the world is for courts to have the power to impose capital punishment. So again, this is a non-controversial example of the same idea. Is it a good or bad thing that we've lost the ability to apply capital management? It depends what you mean. It's sad that society moved away such that there was a diminishing of intuition and understanding that this is something vital to human existence. But in the context of that, it's the best possible thing. None of us would want it to come back. Would we want to be in a world in which courts were enforcing this sort of thing on those who don't appreciate the value and beauty of this? So this is the best possible thing that could have happened under the circumstances. Now Charles, and I'll comment on this briefly, pointed out, obviously you still need a functioning court system. So this is a more complicated discussion. Courts have the ability to imprison if someone's going to be a living danger, if someone is a threat to society. Maybe they would sometimes engage in deterrent punishment. But the core punishments of the Torah are reflecting an existential application of what the core din is. Can you really run a society in which there has to be Eidim and Asra of the level I've described? Of course, on a practical level, a court would need to intervene when someone is doing crimes, but the core existential application, which Chazal understood to include the death penalty, that would cease to apply if the internal changes have happened. So we run out of time for today, but just to summarize, we have a range of classic sources, and please God, next week we'll look at some of the more recent sources that argue that the vision that whenever we see events of history changing, often externally imposed, whether imposed by Kadosh Baruch Hu with Gan Eden, or by the destruction of the Beis Mikdash by the forces of our enemies, or indeed in terms of our own inner failings and our own inner Yetzirah, on every occasion we need to take a dual approach. We need to, on the one hand, mourn the tragedy that led to this on the internal breakdown or societal breakdown that made this happen. And on the other hand, realize that in the context of that happening, this is a bracha, this is a positive. We can't aspire or dream to a theoretical reversion in which we just put the superficial in place. We just give the courts back the power to enforce. We just rebuild the structure of Beis Mikdash. We just move back to a Gan Eden, unless we are willing to have embarked on what the Torah calls the Derech Etz Chaim, the path of the tree of life. Unless we're willing to engage in the internal changes first, which would make the externals appropriate. And we'll look at this in more detail next week, but what I'm arguing therefore is that any question which is around this theme of, surely the Torah would mandate us going back to doing X, if there is a halachic or societal or technical reason why we're not able to do it, it needs to push us to ponder, maybe there's a reason why doing X would be completely inappropriate, and therefore it's correct and justified that it appears to us as the most awful thing we could do under these circumstances, because this wouldn't move us nearer to spirituality, it would move us further away from our shared goal as human beings and as Jews should be. So I'll stop there unless there's any questions, and Mr. next week we'll continue this.
Can someone teach you? I don't know how in the society we live in, you actually get taught this sort of thing. You have to work it out for yourself.
So yes and no. Yes, a lot. It's unfortunately not spoken enough about, which is why I'm speaking about it. No, in the sense that there were figures that spoke about it, particularly in the context of this discussion. Rav Henkin spoke about it, Rav Kook, Rav Sacks, Rav Rabinovich. Rav Rabinovich has a collection of essays in which he speaks about these things. These are very, very important. I think these are very important ideas. That anyway, that's why I'm speaking about them today. That's what I chose as a topic. So yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. There is a spectrum. You're correct. In any area of the Jewish world in which Jews were granted self-government, and from early Middle Ages through to early onset of modernity, and therefore we're talking about in East Europe, where there was the Valda Abarotza self-government, there were parts of North Africa, in the Middle East where there was self-government. Many shuls would have a stocks, for example, and the local court or the Rav could impose. Sometimes I long for those days. Well, imagine. Okay, we'll stop there and.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.